Good evening. The Forbidden Dispensary invites you tonight into something faintly sour, gently intoxicating, and utterly tangled with human lives. A full journey through the story of alcohol, from the first sacred cups to the latest cocktails. Push aside the sleek rooftop bars and the slow-motion movie toasts. The real narrative is murkier, weirder, and far more fundamental than any postcard image. For countless societies across time, alcohol wasn't just indulgence. It was survival. It was food. It was pharmacy. And more often than not, the safest liquid anyone could risk. Dropped into an early farming village without it, you'd be gone in a day. Before you settle in, tap that like button and subscribe if this kind of deep dive hits the spot. Drop a comment with where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. It still floors us at the Forbidden Dispensary to see people watching from every corner of the planet. Now, dim the lights, lean back, and walk with us into tonight's story. At Jiahu, in the lowlands of what's now Henan province, vessels that had slept beneath the soil for 7,000 years held a secret that would make future humans smile, wince, and argue for generations. Chemical ghosts of a fermented liquor dating to about 7,600 BCE stained those pots. The painted shards carried a molecular signature, markers of rice and honey, of hawthorn and wild grape, reading like an ingredient list written in the script of deep prehistory. In the early 21st century, Patrick McGovern and a team of archaeologists coaxed that tale out of tartaric acid and fellow biomarkers. Suddenly, in the mine's theater, a domestic scene flared back to life. Someone tearing apart a loaf, someone stirring a mash, someone scooping thick honey into a jar, sealing the vessel for a while, and later discovering that what quietly frothed inside had turned into something else entirely. Nothing about this is staged. There's no trumpets in the sky. It's quiet, accidental, then over centuries of habit and curiosity, very deliberate. The jars at Jiahu hint at flavor, but they also sit beside bone flutes recovered from the same layers, and together they sketch a plausible picture. Food and music, and the close, hot social tangle of a shared feast where a communal drink meant warmth, gossip, bargaining, and perhaps the first flicker of the sacred. This basic pattern wild fruit, honey and grain meeting wild yeast in the cool dark of an earthen container repeats itself across early Eurasia. In the South Caucasus, sites linked to the Shulaveri Shomu culture and villages such as Gadatrili Gora preserve traces of grape-based fermentation dated to around 6000 BCE. On the Haji Firuz Tepe in the Zagros foothills of western Iran, jars yield tartaric acid consistent with grape wine from roughly 5400 to 5000 BCE. In Neolithic Anatolia, at settlements like Satalhoyuk, lived in from around 7500 to 5700 BCE, grinding stones, hearths, and storage pits crowd the architecture. They show cereal grains being processed, stored, and transformed in ways that made fermentation almost inevitable. The residue built into pottery, the chemicals locked in clay forms a peculiar intimate script. It records what people drank when every other text has rotted to nothing. It tells us what they sank their hands into and what they lifted to the mouths of kin. In those thin films and stains, we see the first hard proof that fermentation wasn't just a one-time surprise. It had become a repeatable technology woven into home routines from the earliest settled fields onward. The chemistry that makes alcohol possible is patient and democratic. Yeasts are everywhere. Sugars wait in grains, fruits, and nectar everywhere. Our first encounters with fermentation were almost certainly a chain of small accidents. A bowl of mashed grain left in the sun a little too long starts to sour. A crushed bunch of grapes forgotten in a jar begins to foam. A honey-sweet gruel thinned with water, left aside and ignored, turns cloudy and lifts a strange scent into the evening air. Someone, somewhere, took that first experimental sip. Curiosity, hunger, ritual obligation, the urgent need to stretch scarce calories, any of a dozen motives could have turned that weird taste from novelty into method. Once people learned that a thick slurry left alone in a sealed pot would sweeten and lift the mood, they began to tame the process. They chose vessels carefully. They timed grain sprouting to promote malting. They reserved certain jars for special days. Fermentation as a technique was as much about organizing people as it was about managing microbes. It demanded shared expectations, a meeting place, and some way of distributing not only the drink, but also the honor and status attached to providing it. Those earliest fermented brews did several unromantic but crucial jobs. They were portable energy in a world where the next harvest was never guaranteed, a way to bank seasonal sugars into a drinkable ration for lean months. They cut the danger of waterborne disease in settlements where wells and surface water crawled with pathogens. Fermented beverages, with their alcohol and acidity, were often less risky than plain water. They also slipped into social economies as gifts and compensation, tools of welcome and peacemaking, and substances keyed to ritual. Libations poured for ancestors, offerings ladled out to gods, provisions stored for the dead. At Jiahu, in the buried Georgian Kvevri, in Neolithic Anatolian villages, the physical remains sunk jars, communal pits, clusters of fine serving vessels speak of gatherings. They hint at moments when crowds assembled and food was eaten as part of politics, marriage rites, and remembrance. You can feel that the invention of intentional fermentation rewrote the rules of communal life. It extended the range of what people could offer and receive. It gave obligation a flavor and a vessel. When you brew and share, you validate kin ties, authority, and debt. A cup going hand to hand around a fire binds in ways we're only just now tracing through isotopes in bones and chemicals in potsherds. As Neolithic villages multiplied and irrigation plus surplus allowed denser towns to form, that quiet household craft scaled up into organized production. In the flatlands of Mesopotamia and along the Nile in Egypt, barley, emmer, and other grains were not just crops. They were the spine of whole economies that required steady staples and reliable caloric throughput. Out of that grain logic came beer, the thick barley-based porridge-like brew that filled the cups of laborers and gods alike. In Sumer, by the later 3rd millennium BCE, and certainly by the Old Babylonian period, beer sat right in the middle of city life. Clay tablets from Uruk, Nippur, and other city-states record ration lists of barley and beer in dry formulaic lines. Soldiers, so many measures. Temple staff, so many. Builders on a project, so many. In the hymn to Ninkasi, a Sumerian song preserved in Old Babylonian copies, but clearly preserving older know-how, brewing itself is honored as a goddess. The hymn sings of Bapir, twice-baked barley loaves crushed and mixed of steaming mash, of straining through reed mats, of the cup that shouts with foam. It reads as prayer and as step-by-step process, and in its verses you can hear a city where production, ritual, and taste are inseparable. In those early urban economies, brewing was both a household routine and a scaled-up industry. Women stood at the center. The word for beer woman, or brew mistress, recurs in both Mesopotamian and Egyptian sources, and surviving images show women pouring, kneading, stirring. At home, the female brewer controlled a crucial staple and gained a measured authority through that role. In temples and palaces, dedicated brew houses with aligned rows of vats and ovens point to a level of production far bigger than a single family. In Egypt, Middle Kingdom towns like Kahun preserve traces of bakeries and breweries right beside worker housing for royal pyramid projects, with ovens and vats lined up neatly and a layout that screams logistics. Feeding an army of builders required a steady stream of bread and jars of beer. In the New Kingdom, ostraca and papyri from Deir el-Medina track rations of beer and bread for skilled artisans. In Old and Middle Kingdom tombs, jars of beer ride with the dead as supplies for the next world. Tutankhamun's tomb included vessels labeled with brew names and vintages, a miniature afterlife pantry. Here, brewing isn't a marginal handicraft, it's a core economic engine, a ritual technology, and, very often, women's work. If we measure work by its social range, the nuts and bolts of ancient brewing, as glimpsed in texts and artwork, show a pragmatic technical culture. Barley was sprouted to convert starch into sugar, then dried. Beer, special bread baked for brewing, was made and sometimes stored. That bread or malt was crumbled into water and warmed into a thick mash. Fermentation began when that mash or sweet liquid sat in jars. Wild yeast doing its slow, invisible work, straining through reeds or sieves, produced something you could actually drink. The result usually wasn't the clear beer the Forbidden Dispensary might pour today. It was a cloudy, nutrient-dense beverage more stew than lager and calorically rich. People drank it through reed straws and from shared bowls. Sumerians measured beer in sea and gur and used it as a unit of pay. Temple and palace bureaucrats became brewers by necessity, making sure rations aligned with grain inflows and that the streams of barley and beer oiled the machinery of office and cult. That machinery had weight. Grain surpluses kept priests and kings, paid guards and fed construction crews. Wherever a state could build canals and collect grain as tax, it could keep breweries stocked and the city running. Beer, in that sense, was a circulating medium in early complex societies. Nutrition, yes, but also an instrument of redistribution. A granary that could convert grain into something drinkable on schedule possessed political leverage. Workers filled their bellies, but with each cup they also absorbed obligations and expectations. The brewery was a node in the web of power. Because brewing needed space, fuel, storage, and organized labor, it naturally attracted central control. Hierarchies fed on beer, and beer fed hierarchies. Temples claimed exclusive rights to certain brews. Taverns bought surplus and turned it into cash or its equivalent. Administrative records carefully listed allocations for priests, soldier guards, and even prisoners. There were public beer houses in these cultures, places where people met, traded, argued, and occasionally got into trouble. Cuneiform tablets mention houses of beer, and legal texts bother to regulate them. Who could run one, what they could sell, penalties for short measures or fraud. Taverns were rumor factories. Laborers converged there, alliances were quietly built there, and states looked at them with wary sideways glances. Alcohol loosens tongues. Even so, both artifacts and texts suggest that a large share of brewing stayed in homes or temporary setups. Taverns were just one node in a spectrum, not the entire system. The Nile had its own beer, with its own notes of power and taste. In Egypt, brewing followed the rhythm of the river's flood and the agricultural year. When waters withdrew and fields were planted, breweries were busy. When harvest came, jars filled. Large brewing installations cluster near workers' cemeteries. Tomb art shows women crushing grain and stirring mash among the necessary chores that kept the tomb owner's K supported. Hathor, a goddess sometimes radiant and sometimes furious, becomes linked with drunkenness in myths where beer pacifies dangerous forces. Temple records list beer poured in sanctuaries as offerings. Practically speaking, handing out beer to workers, whether quarry crews cutting stone or artisans carving tomb walls, was vital project management. Cut the rations, and productivity staggered. Keep them steady, and loyalty followed. Once again, a fermented drink shows up as a tool of management and control as much as an instrument of pleasure. If beer anchored food security and statecraft in river basins, wine claimed its era in the sunburnt hillsides of the Mediterranean, on thin soils where vines clung to terraces and where sea routes made wine portable and profitable. On Crete at Knossos and at other Minoan sites from roughly 2000 to 1400 BCE, wall paintings praise harvest and grape treading, and huge storage pithoi point to palace economies where wine flowed toward elites and sanctuaries. The Mycenaeans, inheriting Minoan habits, left Linear B tablets bureaucratic records that list allocations of wono, wine, to palace storerooms. Wine's layered flavors, its ability to age, to take on spices, to be parceled out in controlled quantities, made it a natural fit for the cultures that would grow into the Greek city-states. By the archaic and classical periods, the Greeks had woven wine into worship, politics, and thought. The symposium, an elite male drinking gathering that flourished from about the 8th to the 4th centuries BCE, functioned as political salon as much as party. Men reclined on couches around a crater, and the hum of talk blended with the pour of wine. Symposia shaped patronage networks, philosophical arguments, and artistic performances. Plato's Symposium, though a philosophical dialogue rather than a straight reportage, uses that drinking party frame to probe love and truth. Its very form shows how central the symposium was to elite discourse. Ritual pouring was equally central. At ceremonies, wine splashed onto the ground for the gods, and Dionysian cults turned intoxication into sacrament and entrance into altered states and initiation. Wine carried its own moral grammar too. Greeks customarily cut wine with water and saw drinking it undiluted as barbaric, even deranged. How you mixed your wine announced your cultural identity as clearly as your language did. Viticulture spread with colonists and seafarers. Greek settlers planted vines at Massalia, modern Marseille, in the 6th century BCE. Phoenician sailors set vines into Iberian soil. Carthaginian estates built up their own vineyards. With colonization came horticultural experimentation, transplanting grape varieties from island to mainland, tuning vines to soils, refining trellising to fit each slope. Within a few centuries, wine had moved from elite luxury to staple economic pillar in zones of southern Europe, North Africa, and the Near East. Amphorae tall, pointed ceramic jars carried wine along the sea routes. Stamped handles and painted inscriptions recorded origin, producer, and sometimes vintage, enough to hint at an early commodity market shaped by brand and place. Rome, inheriting both Greek tastes and Etruscan know-how, industrialized viticulture and turned the vine into one of its most mobile assets. From the Middle Republic through the Empire, wine production ramped up. Estates and villae rusticae specialized. Great latifundia focused on volume. Military colonies in Spain, Gaul, and North Africa planted vineyards as part of Romanization. Agricultural writers, Cato the Elder with De Agricultura around 160 BCE, Varro in the late Republic, Columella in the 1st century. CE left manuals on trellising, grafting, pruning, and winemaking that show a remarkably advanced technical tradition. Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, lists famed wines and their touted qualities: Falernian, Cacuban, Chian, and others. In his catalogue, you can read the early shape of a terroir-based marketplace and reputations tied to place. The Roman state didn't just stand back. It regulated, taxed, stamped, and occasionally subsidized. Amphorae from Baetica, Rhodes, Kos, and Italian ports spun through a massive trading network, whose scale becomes brutally clear at Monte Testaccio in Rome, an artificial hill built from millions of broken amphorae. It's an industrial trash heap that silently records the daily intake of oil and wine in a giant city. Tech traveled with taste. Where Mediterranean shippers couldn't load whole barrels into narrow, creaking hulls, clay amphorae served as modular containers. Sealed with resin or pitch, they guarded wine from air and sea. Romans, at once fussy and pragmatic in palate, cherished aged wines for status, but drank plenty of fresh press for everyday use, sometimes cut with water, sometimes warmed and spiced for health or comfort. They experimented with preservatives and add-ins. Boiled down musts such as de frutum and sapa concentrated sweetness and worked as flavoring and stabilizer. Spices and resins flavored many wines. Less honorably, some producers used lead vessels or sweetened with lead-reduced must, a technique many modern scholars suspect contributed in limited but real ways to chronic lead exposure among certain Roman social strata. Wine doubled as medicine. In the Hippocratic corpus, wine functions as solvent and tonic. Galen uses wine as a vehicle for drugs. At the same time, warnings about excess never disappear. The social rules around wine in Greece and Rome were intricate. The Greeks preached moderation through water mixing and used the symposium to enforce rank with seating and cup order. Romans, with their more flamboyant public banquets and rougher taverns, improvised a different style. The Bacchanalia scandal of 186 BCE, chronicled by Livy, shows Rome's alarm when ecstatic rites linked to Dionysus were suspected of sheltering subversion and sexual license. The Senate's crackdown underscores how managing collective intoxication was a matter of state security. Wine could be a hallmark of civilization, a badge of local pride, a taxable asset, and a potential threat. All this ferment-sealed jars and strained porridges, temple vats and palace pithoi, amphorae stamped with origins and stands of men drinking in amphitheaters, slowly accomplished something enormous. It turned alcohol into a technology of human social life. From Jiahu's mixed rice honey fruit brew, likely sipped in dim communal houses where it warmed hands and loosened voices, to Sumerian breweries feeding the hydraulic politics of the first states, to Mediterranean terrace vineyards whose products traveled in resin-lined amphorae to tables of officials and sailors, fermented drinks stitched together landscapes, labor systems, rights, and legal codes. They trained palates and minted profits. They created jobs brewers, wine merchants, coopers, tavern keepers, and bodies of writing from hymns and recipe poems to farm manuals. They also shaped taxes and law codes, because anything worth drinking eventually becomes something worth taxing. In the late hours, when the last amphora has been drained, and the arguments over age versus youth, terroir versus craft, have gone quiet, we can still trace the trail of jars and reed bundles in sites and texts. The basic equation stays stubbornly simple. Sugar plus yeast plus time equals a new social tool. What shifted in the Bronze and Iron Ages was scale, and with scale came specialization and new cultural genres devoted to taste. We get wine literature about vintages, rules about adulteration, gods claimed and invoked with the very liquids they supposedly inspired. The Sumerian hymn to Ninkasi calls brewing sacred and practical in the same breath. Greek lyric and Roman technical treatises slide back and forth between sensual praise and sober instruction. Across all of it runs a conversation between what we can make in a kitchen pot and what we can build in society using the surplus from those pots. If there's one strange note to leave this part of the night on, it's this. The same ferment that made feasts possible also made new kinds of obligation unavoidable. A buried jar at Jiahu became part of a story about kin and cult. A brewery in became a line in the ledger that bound citizens to work. A vineyard in Campania swelled into an export engine that helped power an empire. Fermentation is humble and domestic, yet it has always carried imperial potential. The first jars preserved a flavor. Later factories and institutions preserved a way of organizing people. Follow the history of alcohol from those first accidental sips to the carefully managed economies of beer and wine, and you're watching something small accumulate into power, taste, and tradition. And because humans, even in their most organized moments, are still creatures of craving and routine, the jars keep shattering, the recipes keep mutating. Every glass passed across a table is both inheritance and experiment. What we call civilization learned to measure itself partly by how it brewed, poured, and policed what it drank. Along the broad sweep of the Yellow and Yangtze river valleys, in wet reed beds and warm hollows where rice and millet waited patiently in the soil, people in early China discovered that starch could be coaxed into sweetness, sweetness into foam, and foam into a different kind of fire. Archaeologists love to point back to Jiahu in northern Henan. That Neolithic site dated to around 7,600 BCE, where the residue in ceramic jars seems to whisper of first experiments. Traces of rice, honey, and fruit, a mingle of wild yeasts that you can almost picture, silent and busy in the half-dark. That residue is more than chemistry. It's the fingerprint of a forming habit. It tells us that long before law codes, bronze bells, or royal banquets, there were drinks passed from hand to hand, cup to mouth, that altered mood and drew people tighter together. In Chinese, the word ju would later come to stand for all such intoxicating liquids. By the Bronze Age, custom had finally caught up with appetite. Ritual bronzes, the Jue, the Guang, the Zun appear in Shang and Zhou tombs. Roughly 1600–221 BCE, their shapes designed to heat, pour, and present offerings to ancestors. The Book of Songs sings of cups and toasts. Zhou ritual manuals describe wine as indispensable to ancestor worship. If you listen in imagination, you can still hear bowls clinking in the dusty echo of old court halls. The technologies, as always, were local and inventive. In the millet belt of the north and the rice terraces of the south, each climate and grain stock posed different problems. You had stored grain, sticky summers, invasive insects. These pressures nudged Chinese brewers to refine their craft. One of the great quiet innovations was small cakes of grain, carrying a living community of molds and yeasts. This method of saccharification let them turn starch into sugar without malting in the Western sense. Q and its cousins are the subtle genius of East Asian fermentation. By nurturing and drying cultures of aspergillus and related organisms, brewers could steam rice or millet, then pitch in these starter bricks and let embedded enzymes do the job that malted barley does in Europe. The agricultural handbook Qimin Yaoshu, compiled by Jia Sixi in the mid-6th century CE, lays out these processes with calm precision: how to steam, how to cool, how to pick the right day for the jars to come alive. The surviving imagery earthen jars wax-sealed, pits lined with straw, steam rising from wooden tuns, says, without fanfare, that this was daily labor as much as it was ritual performance. Across the Indian subcontinent, the story runs to a different beat, but with the same human urge behind it. The Rig Veda, composed and compiled in hymns between roughly 1500 and 1200 BCE, and recited for generations afterward, is saturated with ecstatic invocations of soma, a pressed sacred liquid offered to gods, and to which those gods, in the verses, seem addicted. Ritual directions in those hymns describe pressing, mixing, filtering, and offering. The word soma becomes a pivot where theology and intoxication turn around each other. What soma actually was, an ephedra plant, a mushroom, an opiate, a complex infusion, is still debated by philologists and botanists. That stubborn uncertainty reminds us how broad early experimentation really was. By the later Vedic periods, another set of drinks had stepped into the public role: Sura and Maireya, stronger liquors that appear in law texts and household manuals, clustered around both social rituals and punishments. So the story of alcohol in South Asia becomes both cosmological and intensely practical. Palm wines tadi, kalu, are drawn from coconut and palmyra, palms along the coasts. Rice ferments bubble in upland settlements. Toddy tapping is at once trade and ritual craft. Families pass it down. Tappers climb into the early light on improvised scaffolds, cut, bind, and set pots to catch sap before the heat wakes the insects. Ayurvedic texts, sprawling over centuries, treat fermented preparations as medicine: herbs steeped in wine to cut phlegm, warming tonics to steady a weak digestive fire, tinctures to blunt pain. Cure and enjoyment live next door, sometimes sharing the same doorway. Southeast Asia, wired by monsoon and trade winds, becomes a crucible where rice, palm, and seafaring exchange generate new drinks and customs. On the Indonesian archipelago, fermented rice known as tapai and its close relatives brem and baram are at once sustenance and sacrament. Tapai sticky rice inoculated with ragi, a starter culture grown on leaves or husks, is sweet, alive, eaten and shared, used from household rites to festival ceremonies. In the Malay world, tuak made from palm sap, perfumed longhouses and palace courts in Srivijaya and later Malacca, where sailors, traders and priests all drank from the same jug. In Burmese highlands and across the Tibetan plateau, barley beers like Chang send steam into cold rooms and are sipped from common bowls, their yeasty warmth cutting the chill. Starter cultures have different names: Nuruk in Korea, ragi in Indonesia, QU in China. But the core idea is stable. Capture the right microbes, feed them cooked starch, and let them sing. Because these cultures are portable, tucked into cloth, smeared on grain, nestled in jars, they travel along with people as trade networks expand. Coastal boats, river junks, caravans running the island-studded map of the monsoon world all trade not just spices, but microbes and methods. We should pause on that traffic. Between the 7th and 15th centuries, the Indian Ocean effectively becomes a shipping lane for fermentable ideas. Ports like Guangzhou and Quanzhou on the Chinese coast, Calicut on India's Malabar shore, Palembang and Srivijaya on Sumatra, and later Malacca and Ayutthaya all stand as relay points where not only cloth, pepper, and porcelain change hands, but recipes, still designs, and starter cultures. A Persian merchant watching Chinese QU might think of his own sour starters. An Arab alchemist might demonstrate a copper still to a Chinese metalworker, who then adapts it for distilling medicinal waters. Distillation itself, when it emerges, is less a single spark, and more the convergence of old practices with better tools. Arabic alchemists like Jabir ibn Hayyan and his successors, working between the 8th and 10th centuries, refine the alembic and write about concentrating essences, making aqua vitae, water of life, that captures volatile spirits from plants. That conceptual leap migrates, sometimes through translated texts carried by scholars, sometimes through artisans simply showing each other equipment. By the medieval and early modern periods, distillation has gone local in many parts of Asia, shifting towards strong spirits that fit local tastes. Eventually, China's baijiu and diverse palm and rice arak across Southeast Asia. But through most of the region's early story, alcohol means fermentation. Clay jars in kitchens and shrine rooms, village breweries humming in the background of daily life, ladles of rice wine tipped out for the dead and for guests. Those jars make themselves at home in both sacred rooms and smoky kitchens. The most persistent lesson from these Asian landscapes is that alcohol, whatever its molecular structure, earns its meaning from how it's used. In one valley, it becomes sacrament. In another, medicine. In another, harvest staple. In China, the pairing of ancestor tablets and wine cups recreates bonds across generations. To pour is to remember, to drink is to confirm who belongs and in what order. In India, Vedic hymns to Soma and later tantric rites place intoxicants in the very throat of divinity, sometimes as fuel for vision, sometimes as a test of commitment. In the rice terraces of Southeast Asia, a jar opened at the new rice festival acts as a hinge between Earth's yield and human celebration. A shared bowl raised under the moon creates a temporary solidarity, a brief inebriated present that both loosens and binds. The historical evidence potsherds stained with dried sugars, verses set in sacred texts, travelogues scratched down by thirsty sailors, gives us not one story, but a whole economy of uses. And that economy ties directly into an older, broader architecture of human life, religion and medicine. Across Eurasia, alcoholic liquids slide between altar and clinic, like a substance with two official names. Poured into earth as offerings to the dead, into mouths as cure. Praised as divine, cursed as demonic. This is not clumsy hypocrisy, it's prolonged ambivalence, anchored in alcohol's double ability to open emotional channels and to destabilize social order. The Greeks had Dionysus and the wine-dark sea. The Romans had Bacchic rites, at times outlawed because unsupervised mass intoxication made senators nervous. Hebrew scripture speaks of wine in blessing and in warning, and rabbinic law threads a careful path around when, how, and how much to drink. In Christianity, the issue becomes fully theological. Wine's role in the Eucharist, rooted in gospel accounts, forged into doctrine by early church writers, makes fermented grape juice something more than beverage. It becomes a visible sign of grace, Christ's blood made sensibly present. That sacramental reality shields wine inside church walls, even as preachers rail against drunkenness in the streets. St. Benedict in the 6th century advises moderation, but insists monasteries must offer hospitality, which usually means beer or wine. Augustine and other fathers echo the warning that flesh is weak and must stay in charge. Yet in practical monastic life, those same monasteries that guarded manuscripts and medical knowledge, wine and beer are basic resources. Fuel for patients, carriers for medicines, safe hydration for lay brothers doing heavy work. The ambivalence is even sharper in the Islamic world, where clear scriptural prohibitions against intoxicants share space with remarkably advanced medicine and alchemy. The Quran and Hadith classify intoxication as morally dangerous, yet Arab and Persian physicians and chemists across the medieval centuries adopt distillation as an essential technical trick. Ibn Sina, Avicenna, writing around 980–1037 in the Canon of Medicine, discusses preserved and distilled wines as vehicles for plant medicines and as therapeutic agents themselves. Al-Razi, Rhazes, and others describe distilled alcohol as solvent and antiseptic. The contradiction is more apparent than real. For perfume, for ointments, for topical tinctures, alcohol is miraculous. For the shared dinner table, it's forbidden. In practice, people negotiate the slope between those poles, and the medical vocabulary often becomes a kind of cultural workaround. If a distillate heals, medical ink can legitimize what ordinary drinking customs might not. Medicine more generally reinforces alcohol's social position. From Hippocratic recipes in classical Greece to Galen's humoral framework, wine is a primary solvent, digestive tool, and temperamental adjuster. Galen, working in the 2nd century CE, classifies wines by warmth and dryness, prescribing different ones for different bodily dispositions, one for melancholics, another for phlegmatic patients. His system flows forward into medieval European practice and into Islamic medical writing, later translated to Latin. On the practical side, many plant compounds dissolve best in alcohol. Tinctures keep for seasons when plain water would rot. Apothecaries submerge herbs in wine to turn them into cordials and elixirs. The aqua vitae distilled by alchemists becomes an intensified carrier for these remedies. It's no accident that so many languages call strong spirits water of life, from Latin aqua vitae to Gaelic uisce beata to English whiskey. The still lets pharmacopoeias concentrate their power. Religions respond with mixed strategies, principle plus compromise. Buddhism's 5 precepts include abstaining from intoxicants that cloud the mind, but the lived Buddhism of Asia is diverse enough to show both strict sobriety and localized tolerance. Tibetan tantric practice, for example, has long used Chang barley beer in ritual offerings, symbolically potent in a path where the body itself can be turned toward liberation. Hinduism also holds both suspicion and exception. Many orthodox Brahmanical codes frown on intoxication, while certain Shakta and Tantric currents explicitly ritualize wine and meat things, otherwise forbidden in Brahmanical householder rules. The point isn't shock value, it's context. Symbolic meaning is always local. Alcohol can be sacrament in one rite and sin in another, disinfectant in the surgeon's tent, and fuel for rivalry in the village square. Practical realities underpin the sacred talk. Water in many pre-modern towns was an unreliable friend. Fermentation, by lowering microbial load and preserving liquid inside ethanol, made certain drinks safer. Low-strength small beer in Northern Europe, warm and nutritious, becomes an everyday drink for laborers modest in buzz, heavy in calories, and safer than a random well. In agrarian Asia, rice wine plays a similar niche. Caloric, warm, microbially safer than surface water. Even today, many rituals that call for liquid offerings double as social provisioning, a sanctioned way of distributing surplus grain as a drink that keeps and travels. Health, piety, and economy twist tightly together here, resisting any easy moral sentence. Then come Europe's medieval villages and cloisters, with their timbered roofs smelling of smoke and mash, taking these long precedents and building a new kind of social structure on top of them. Monastic orders, Benedictine, Cistercian, later Augustinian preserve texts and practice agriculture and fermentation with a disciplined eye. The famous plan of St. Gall, drawn around 820–830 CE, includes a brewhouse in its ideal monastery layout, an admission that the prayer life, charity, and hospitality of a house all depend on a steady, controlled flow of fermented drink. Monasteries built granaries, maltings, herb gardens, infirmaries. They served as banks of technical memory. Monks copied classical works and then adapted them. They terraced hillsides for vines. In places like Burgundy, Benedictines and Cistercians shaped viticulture so thoroughly that regional wine identity still bears their fingerprints. Hildegard of Bingen, 1098–1179, abbess and polymath, wrote extensively on herbal medicine and advised wines infused with specific plants for specific ailments. Her theories, like Galen's, fused temperament with flavor. But brewing in medieval Europe never stayed inside abbey walls. For most households, brewing was domestic, female work. Alewives, women brewing at home for family and sometimes for sale, stood over kettles and mash tuns, turning kitchens into mini economies. As towns grew and demand for consistency rose, brewing professionalized. Kettles got bigger. Dedicated brew houses appeared. Men increasingly dominated the trade as capital and volume changed who controlled the craft. Urban guilds emerged to regulate standards and training. Brewers joined corporations that guarded trade secrets, petitioned for privileges, and defended prices. Legal frameworks like England's Assize of Bread and Ale subjected these staples to price and quality control. Ale conners, town officers, literally tasted the product to protect the public and keep sellers honest. Councils licensed inns and alehouses, worrying as much about order and tax revenue as about anyone's soul. The public house became a kind of furnace at the center of communal life. Rumor exchange, bargaining room, courtship scene, grievance stage. City life simmered there. In parallel, technology quietly shifted. Beer and ale began to diverge in taste, partly because of how slowly Europe adopted hops. Before hops, many northern brews used a bitter mix of herbs like bog myrtle, yarrow, and juniper to balance sweetness and help preserve beer. Hops, with their resins and antibacterial compounds, gradually transformed the drink. Hopped beer lasted longer and traveled farther. The Hallertau and other German hop regions sowed fields that by the later Middle Ages would become essential to turning beer into a durable trade good. Hopped beer survived river trips and coastal voyages, opening regional markets. Hanseatic and North Sea towns traded malt and beer like standardized products. With that trade came regulation and taxation. The Reinheitsgebot of 1516, later than the medieval core of this story, but on the same arc codified purity in Bavaria, naming water, barley, and hops as beer's only allowed ingredients. That law capped a long period of negotiation among farmers, brewers, merchants, and officials over what counted as quality, how much it should cost, and who got squeezed in bad years. Behind every cup sat a chain of logistics. Grain had to be grown, then malted on kilns that ate wood and labor. Millers and coopers mattered as much as brewers. Barrels were both container and currency. Seasons set the tempo. Barley had to be stored, hops harvested and dried, wort boiled in shared kettles. Look closely at a medieval town's economic pulse, and you see the baker's oven and brewer's copper sharing air in the same courtyard. The alehouse bench not far from the market crier's posts. When a lord claimed exclusive brewing rights, or a town capped the number of taverns, those decisions spoke as loudly about controlling supply and extracting tax as about curbing vice. Ale became fiscal instrument as much as fuel for fellowship. So the medieval world, with all its devotions, ploughing, and slow court procedures, made space for alcohol as something daily and decisive. It was the warmth at the end of a harvest day, the cordial in the infirmary, the chalice in the chapel, and the accelerant in brawls. That tension between necessity and danger, between function and fantasy, is ancient. It ties together the human story from Jiahu's rice jars to St. Gall's brewhouse. Across Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, Fermented and later distilled drinks served as vehicles for trading ideas, microbes, rites, and laws. They moved in shipholds and pilgrim hands, appeared in treaties and hospital records, linked monasteries to marketplaces and temples to taverns. If there's a grim little joke in the path so far, it's this. Wherever there's surplus grain, there's someone tempted to ferment it into a liquid that some call sacred, others medicinal, and nearly everyone eventually calls recreational. Underneath the joke runs a more intricate truth. This is a story of logistics and scale, how communities learned to move calories, manage fermentation, and coordinate labor, so a village could stay fed, a monastery could stay hospitable, and a town could stay profitable. It's a story of overlapping meanings. A cup that cleansed a wound in the infirmary was shaped like the same cup raised in a wedding toast. Lines between devotion, healing, and fun stayed blurry. It's also a story of technical transfer starters and stills traveling with merchants, monks translating herbal cures from Arabic physicians who in turn had inherited Greek humoral theories, port cities mapping routes not just for goods, but for tastes. We end this chapter with scale in mind. One jar in a grave, one hymn to Soma, one monastery blueprint on their own, their fragments. Sewn together, they form a continental tapestry. A fermenting jar in a Southeast Asian house, its clay rim warm to the touch, a faint scent of yeast and banana leaf starter, is the same human project as a copper alembic sweating in an Arabic laboratory, or an oak cask rolled into a Flemish cellar. In every case, people face the same bundle of constraints: resources and needs, seasons and storage, ritual and remedy. They learned, slowly, to harness microbes, to scale production when crowds demanded it, and to clothe use in languages of holiness or harm, depending on what their scriptures and physicians said. There's a stubborn practicality in that thread. Drinkers and brewers have always managed the world with taste as much as with statute. Long before factories, those small technologies of fermentation and distillation tied together economies, ceremonies, and rites of passage. This story has no simple hero. It's a chain of experiments and adjustments, of jars, scrolls, and salted letters between ports. It shows that a drink is never just chemistry. It carries the climate of a valley, the rulebook of a city, the liturgy of a shrine. And it reminds us gently that the history of alcohol is the history of human ingenuity and human contradiction, an art of turning grain and fruit into comfort and communion, into medicine and mischief, with consequences as intimate as a good night's sleep, and as vast as the trade routes that keep the world in motion. The Forbidden Dispensary now turns toward the next chapter, the moment when vapors are caught, concentrated, and turned into something far stronger than any ancient porridge beer, and the dim glass-walled rooms of Hellenistic Alexandria, and in shadowed corners of Egyptian workshops before and after, artisans and thinkers began to notice that vapors could be coaxed out of liquids and then recaptured, yielding something other than the perfumed oils they had been chasing for centuries. Picture glass clinking softly, crude pear-shaped retorts catching firelight, curious eyes following scented steam as it curls into cool receiver flasks. These were experiments driven more by intuition and patience than formal theory. Shepherding smoke into liquid, catching essences in glass. Zosimos of Panopolis, writing in the late 3rd and early 4th centuries CE, describes apparatus that looks strikingly modern in silhouette. Maria the Jewess, Maria Prophetessa, remembered in later medieval sources, earns credit for devices anticipating key parts of the alembic. These Hellenistic and late antique experimenters weren't yet distilling alcohol for everyday use, but they were advancing the toolkit. They were teaching the world how to separate and recombine, how to watch for that sweet moment when a volatile spirit breaks from its watery partner and condenses into something subtly different. That technical heritage found new urgency and refinement in the laboratories of the Islamic world. In cities like Kufa and later in the great cosmopolitan hubs of Baghdad and Cairo, scholars clustered in the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, and in private workshops to translate, test, and expand on those Greek recipes. By the 8th and 9th centuries, under the Abbasids, this culture of inquiry had produced both conceptual and hardware upgrades. Metalworkers and glassmakers crafted better cucurbits and receivers. Chemists and physicians learned finer control over heat and cooling. Jabir ibn Hayyan, to Latin Europe, Geber, a semi-legendary figure of the late 8th, early 9th century, wrote extensively about distillation and apparatus. Al-Razi, Raziz, c. 854–925, the Persian polymath, described ways to concentrate substances and extract active principles. It's in this milieu that many of our familiar terms take shape. Al-Inbiyak becomes alembic. Al-Kul, once referring to a fine powdered cosmetic, shifts in meaning and helps give rise to the European alcohol. These weren't abstract toys. Distillation immediately found its place in pharmacy. Physicians discovered that when wines or herbal macerations were gently heated and the vapors trapped, the condensed liquid could carry plant medicines, clean wounds, and store active compounds in hot climates. Distilled liquid stronger, more stable preserved tinctures that would otherwise spoil. Alchemists and apothecaries argued about dosage and use, but aqua vitae and related waters became fixtures on shelves from Al-Andalus to Baghdad. When Arabic treatises filtered westward through Sicily, through Muslim Spain, into Salerno and Paris, they arrived in a Europe rebuilding its intellectual scaffolding. The translation movement in Toledo in the 12th century, with figures like Gerard of Cremona and earlier Constantine the African in the 11th century, created corridors not only for philosophy but for technical manuals. Medical schools at Salerno and Montpellier suddenly had access to detailed descriptions of stills and cooling coils. Monastic infirmaries and town apothecaries adopted this glass and copper. The alembic became, quietly, a medical device. By the 13th and 14th centuries, European physicians such as Arnold of Villanova were recommending distilled spirits as treatments. The Franciscan John of Rupeshisa, living through the horrors of the mid-14th century, preached that the quintessence of wine, the concentrated spirit, was a medicine and perhaps a shield against plague. There's an irony tucked inside that phrase aqua vitae. Distilled alcohol, in its European debut, is framed as life water. Curative, preservative, controlled by clerics and doctors, hardly a barroom temptation. But once the material existed, keeping it confined to pharmacy shelves proved impossible. Technically, the jump from fermented beer and wine to intentional distillation of alcohol wasn't one lightning stroke. It was a series of improvements in metalwork, glass, and temperature control. Early glass or ceramic alembics gave way in many areas to copper stills and better condensers. The ability to maintain a moderate, even heat, to manage reflux, and to collect a fraction that boils below water's temperature all contributed to a more potent, more consistent spirit. This was a material revolution as much as an intellectual one. Copper's heat conductivity, the stillman's eye for flame, the glassblower's and cooper's skills all converged. The distillates themselves were as varied as their sources. Aqua vitae in Latin texts, brandy in coastal wine regions, schnapps in German hinterlands, arak and arak along eastern trade winds. Each region distilled whatever it already fermented wine into brandies and eau de vie, grains into grain spirits that prefigured vodka and schnapps, palm wine and rice ferments into local high-proof liquors. The social and economic ripples were quick. In pharmacies, spirits stretched the life of tinctures and created stronger doses in smaller volumes. For soldiers and travelers, distilled drinks carried more calories and comfort per barrel and resisted spoilage better than beer or water. Merchants discovered they could concentrate value-moving strong drink in compact casks, cutting transport costs. States noticed that distilleries and spirits were easy to tax at both production and sale. Licenses and excises on distilling, retail, and shipment became dependable lines in state budgets. Distillation was thus a logistical innovation. It changed what fit in a barrel and how far it could travel in usable form. This becomes most visible when we follow sugarcane and the smell of molasses into the age of oceanic empires. Sugar itself had a long prelude grown in South and Southeast Asia, carried west into the Mediterranean by Arab agriculture, prized as a luxury in medieval Europe. But plantation sugar monocropped, capital-heavy, Atlantic takes shape with early modern colonialism. From the Portuguese plantations on Madeira and other Atlantic islands in the 15th century, to the seizure and refashioning of Caribbean islands by English, French, Spanish, and Dutch colonists in the 16th and 17th, cane fields became engines of export. Mills crushed stalks, boiling houses reduced juice to crystals, and thick brown molasses poured from the process as sticky waste. For a while, molasses was near worthless byproduct. Then, inevitably, some planter and stillman joined forces. Molasses plus water plus yeast plus a still equals rum. Rum shows up clearly in the 17th century English Caribbean. Barbados, colonized from the 1620s, had become a sugar-dominated economy by mid-century. Jamaica, seized by England in 1655, followed its example. Cane was milled by wind or animal power, juice boiled to crystals in roaring hot houses, and hogsheads of sugar rolled toward ships. Leftover molasses collected in vats, mixed with water and often dander or dunder, spent stillage from previous batches, it fermented, then ran through simple pot stills. The fiery distillate acquired a wheelbarrow of names: rum, rumbullion, kill devil, half affectionate, half exasperated. Rum quickly found its place in a wider triangle: Europe, Africa, the Americas. Sugar and rum sailed to Europe and to New England. Rum and manufactured goods sailed to West African coasts and were traded for enslaved people. Those captives were forced across the Atlantic to work the very plantations that produced more cane, sugar, molasses, and rum. This needs stating calmly, without sensationalism, because the reality is brutal enough on its own. The logistics of sugar and rum locked into the logistics of slavery, chartered companies, and state policy. The Royal African Company, chartered in 1672 under English royal sponsorship, and the Dutch West India Company before it, coordinated and profited from these circuits. Planters borrowed on future crops, merchants insured ships, new financial tools and infrastructure, roads, quays, mills, appeared that look eerily like industrialization centuries before the Industrial Revolution proper. Rum ceased to be a local curiosity. New England, especially ports like Boston, Newport, and Salem, imported Caribbean molasses and turned it into rum in their own distilleries. That New England rum then sailed as part of cargoes to West Africa, closing a local version of the triangular trade. Parliament's Molasses Act of 1733 tried to shove this commerce toward British plantations by slapping heavy duties on non-British molasses, an effort less about morality than about propping up imperial planters. New England merchants responded with smuggling, creative paperwork, and more sophisticated networks. The resentment and evasions these duties nurtured would join the list of colonial grievances. By the mid-18th century, sugar and rum had braided distant landscapes together. Caribbean estates, New England stillhouses, West African ports, and European buyers all depended on each other in a shared circuit of credit and violence. On the ships that plied these routes, rum carved itself a second identity: ration. Sailors valued a daily tot of spirits. It braced them for cold nights and brutal work, masked foul water when diluted, and eased the boredom of long crossings. The Royal Navy, with its rum and later its diluted rum grog, introduced by Admiral Edward Vernon in 1740 to curb drunkenness, made a ritual of this. Ship logs and pay records show rum as more than a commodity. It was part pay, part morale tool, part liquid discipline. In many Atlantic ports, rum functioned as currency. Where coins were scarce, small casks paid wages, settled debts, greased deals. Rum's proximity to money was practical. Barrels stored well, moved easily, and could be sold or drunk as needed. Back in European cities, the rising tide of distilled spirits, brandy, arrack, schnapps, and eventually cheap grain spirits reshaped urban life. Taverns, alehouses, inns, and the newer coffee houses weren't just drinking spots. They became nodes for information, credit, lodging, and politics. They were the places where traders haggled, pamphlets were read, news repeated, letters left and collected. Alehouses and taverns had medieval roots, but the 17th and 18th centuries saw them evolve. Coffee houses appearing in London around the 1650s, helped along by figures like Pasqua Rosé, an Armenian in the service of a Levant merchant, gave Londoners an alternative to the alehouse. Quieter rooms, newspapers on tables, a clientele that prized talk. Edward Lloyd's Coffee House, founded around 1688, became the informal exchange of shipping news, the seed that would grow into Lloyd's of London. These venues, especially coffee houses, helped form what later thinkers would call the public sphere, spaces where business people, writers, and political agents met, shared information, and molded opinion. They were, in their own way, logistical tools. A merchant in the right coffee house could learn routing and insurance news faster than his rivals. More ordinary alehouses served neighborhoods as social centers. Taverns doubled as notice boards and meeting halls for guilds, but also, in the eyes of the magistrates, as nests of disorder. When distilled spirits got cheap, especially gin in 18th century England, elite fears sharpened. The English gin craze offers a sharp case study of how policy, prices, and population density interact. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, a mix of permissive distilling laws, cheap grain, and a swelling urban poor in London generated a market for dirt-cheap gin, some domestic, some imported as Dutch Geneva. Policymakers at times liked this. Encouraging grain distillation weakened the pull of imported French brandy and gave farmers another outlet. On the streets, the result was gin shops on nearly every corner in some districts, gin cheaper than beer, readily available to men, women, and whole families. Elite commentary responded with hysteria. Artists like William Hogarth etched Gin Lane in 1751, a savage satire showing urban collapse supposedly driven by gin. Parliament responded with a chain of gin acts, 1729, 1736, 1743, and finally 1751. The 1736 Act tried to impose ruinous license fees and taxes. Enforcement crumbled under bribes and riots. The 1751 Act shifted tactics, tightening local licensing and making life harder for small, unlicensed sellers. Over time, combined with changing wages and tastes, it helped tamp down the worst extremes. The politics of gin were never purely about virtue. They were also about control and cash. Excisemen, licenses, and tavern surveillance gave the state levers overcrowded cities. Public panic about drunkenness tangled with class fear. Mixed-class spaces where the poor gathered and worked out shared grievances worried the authorities. In colonial America, taverns' civic roles are even more obvious. Boston's Green Dragon Tavern, Philadelphia's City Tavern, and countless roadside inns became rallying spots for political clubs and committees of correspondence. The infrastructure of dissent discussion, rumor, planning ran through taprooms. Alongside all this, a class-coded taste map formed. Coffee houses, tea rooms, and polite assembly rooms marked middle and upper-class sociability, with rules of decorum and careful public performance. Taverns and alehouses were rougher, more mixed. Wines and brandies mapped onto elite travel and sophistication. Beer and ale remained staple drinks. Cheap spirits became the intoxicant of those pushed hardest by urbanization. Taxation and regulation kept folding back into this cultural fabric. Governments discovered they could steer demand, shelter favored producers, and pad treasuries by tweaking taxes and licenses on different drinks. Navigation acts and tariffs, as well as colonial duties like the Molasses Act of 1733 and the Sugar Act of 1764, used alcohol and its inputs as levers of imperial strategy. Merchants smuggled and schemed around them. The efficacy of any law depended less on its text than on customs officers and local magistrates. By the late 18th century, the alembic had become a truly global technology. A chemist in Cairo, an apothecary in Montpellier, a planter in Barbados, a distiller in London, they all lived in a world that knew how to turn liquid to vapor and back again, to pack power into smaller volumes. Those vapors fueled ships, filled treasuries, lubricated markets, softened grief in taverns, and stoked anxiety in city councils. If you picture the slow refinement of distillation glass tubes lashed together, a copper coil dripping the first clear drops, you should also picture what those drops did. They strengthened existing trade routes, intensified labor systems, and changed the rhythm of nights in port cities. A compact device, the alembic, turned out to have vast consequences. It enabled goods that fit in barrels and dreams at the same time, mediums of exchange, tools of empire, catalysts for new kinds of urban sociability. From still to sugar mill, from merchant ledger to tavern bill, the story of early modern spirits is a story of movement. Knowledge, goods, bodies. Laboratories and plantations were two faces of the same map. Curiosity in the lab met profit calculus on the plantation and in the counting house. Each small advance better condensers, improved cane mills, more efficient shipping manifests, reshaped how people drank, how they worked, how they were governed. In the hush of a late hour, candle down to its nub, and the distant rumble of a harbor fading, you can see the pattern. An instrument that concentrates vapor becomes a commodity that crosses oceans. A commodity enters a city and remakes a street. A remade street becomes a stage for new arguments, some whispered, some shouted. The hiss of a still and the creak of a plantation windmill belong to the same soundtrack. The tavern, the alehouse, the coffeehouse, each molded daily experience in cities where paper and rumor mattered as much as ropes and barrels. Coffeehouses invited the reading class into a world of print. Taverns invited sailors and shopkeepers into talk and negotiation. Both turned beverages into infrastructure for public life. Newspapers grew with these venues. A penny bought not just a drink, but access to news. News, in turn, shaped markets and revolutions. It's no accident that insurance syndicates and trading clubs rooted themselves in specific coffeehouses. Financial institutions emerged in spaces where steam from cups mixed with the scratching of quills. In the end, what marks this chapter of alcohol's history is the collision of technology and society. Distillation gave medicine, commerce, and households a new tool. Plantation sugar turned a sticky byproduct into a global commodity rum, whose logic depended on ships, warehouses, credit, and enslavement. Urban taverns and coffeehouses absorbed these spirits into everyday routines, breeding new forms of public and triggering new waves of regulation. Rules, taxes, licenses, partial bans were always about revenue and order as much as about morality. They were the instruments of states learning, often clumsily, how to govern populations that were more mobile and more vocal than ever. From Hellenistic experiments to Islamic refinements to European adoption, the line of distillation is a story of tools going to work. Copper and glass, heat and vapor, cane and press, barrel and account book. These are the quiet instruments that nudge taste and society into new shapes. By the 19th century, another set of machines would join the orchestra: steam engines, refrigeration compressors, bottling lines. Industrial power would step into the brewhouse. The 19th century rebuilt the machinery of flavor. Breweries that once smelled only of sweat, grain, and the warm, living breath of yeast began to whir with gears and valves. Their rhythms synced to the push of pistons rather than the pace of Cooper's footsteps. Steam engines, already turning factory shafts and ship propellers, found a natural home in mash tunes and malt mills. Roller mills crushed barley more finely. Pumps moved hot liquor and wort with a regularity no human bucket brigade could match, and huge mechanical paddles stirred copper kettles. Where just decades earlier a village ale had been the work of a few hands, an industrial brewery could now move tons of malt and hops from mash to fermentation in a single day. In England, the great Burton-upon-Trent breweries Bass, Allsop and others swelled in size and reach, exploiting local water rich in gypsum to make pale ales that kept well and travelled far. Bass's Red Triangle became one of the first registered trademarks under Britain's new trademark laws in the 1870s, a quiet sign that brewing at scale and modern branding was starting to talk to each other across oceans. In Bavaria and Bohemia, the soundscape changed too. By mid-century, lager breweries were thinking like factories: mechanized malt kilns, coordinated labor, and expanding cellars to supply fast-growing cities and export markets. Lager brewing had one big technical constraint: temperature. Bottom fermenting yeasts and the long cold maturation they require had historically pinned lager to caves, deep cellars, and winter schedules. In Plzeň in 1842, a Bavarian brewer named Josef Groll combined pale malt, soft water, noble Saaz hops, and lager yeast to create what became Pilsner Urquell, a brilliantly clear, bitter golden beer. But making that style consistently required reliably cold storage. For much of the century, such beers were local, seasonal, or limited to regions with natural caves and cool climates. Then refrigeration arrived. Mechanical refrigeration, developed and popularized by engineers like Carl von Linde in the 1870s, broke the climate leash. Refrigeration plants allowed brewers to control temperature year-round, move lagering out of caves into chilled tanks, and locate breweries in places where cold rock cellars were impossible. Once you could manufacture cold, you could brew lager reliably in Hamburg, Chicago, or Melbourne. A taste once tied to specific landscapes began drifting toward global ubiquity. Behind this stood a cluster of scientific breakthroughs. Louis Pasteur's mid-century studies of fermentation stripped away superstition. Yeasts weren't mysterious emanations from the mash. They were living organisms whose behavior could be studied, nurtured, and defended. Pasteur's work pointed brewers toward heat and hygiene. Kill spoilage organisms, protect the right yeast, extend shelf life, make beer that could survive transport. At Carlsberg in Copenhagen, J.C. Jacobsen established a brewery laboratory in the 1870s. There, Emil Christian Hansen isolated pure yeast strains in the 1880s, solving another ongoing headache: unpredictable fermentations. With pure cultures, pasteurization to suppress unwanted bacteria, and temperature control, breweries could aim for reproducibility. You could order the same pale lager in two distant cities and expect nearly identical taste. Science had handed mass production a stable flavor profile. Mechanization finished that transformation and made it portable. The crown cork, patented by William Painter in 1892, let bottlers seal glass securely and cheaply. Michael J. Owens's automated bottle blowing machines in the early 1900s replaced hand-formed bottles with uniform, mass-produced glass. Conveyors lined bottles up for filling, pasteurization, and labeling. Railroads and soon refrigerated rail cars carried beer and bottled spirits across continents with growing confidence. Breweries with enough capital to invest in refrigeration, bottling, and rail logistics could undercut smaller local rivals. In St. Louis, Anheuser-Busch wove these threads together: refrigerated rail cars, pasteurization, aggressive branding, to turn Budweiser into a beer that could define American taste from coast to coast. Milwaukee's breweries, Schlitz, Pabst, Miller rode similar strategies, using scale and distribution to claim both national and export markets. Scale summoned the machinery of persuasion. Brands became promises, visual contracts in an age of mass literacy and cheap color printing. Bass's Red Triangle wasn't just a mark on a cask. It was an early exercise in corporate identity. Brewers and distillers hung lithographed posters, distributed branded calendars and glassware, painted walls, and lit signs that glowed above city streets. Pabst wrapped a literal blue ribbon around its bottles and spun a story of prizes. Schlitz boasted of scientific cleanliness and ran with the beer that made Milwaukee famous. Guinness, rooted in Dublin, turned harp crests and chunky type into an international symbol of stout and good cheer. Scotch and Irish producers like Johnny Walker and Jameson built reputations on blending consistency, selling their bottles from London to Calcutta as both safe and sophisticated. Advertising did more than move units. It trained palates. It taught millions that pale lager was modern clear, cold, refreshing, that bottled beer belonged beside lunch in an office break, that labels signaled dependable experience no matter where you were. Business models adapted. In Britain, the tied house system, in which breweries owned pubs and controlled what they sold, became standard. In the United States, brewery-owned saloons played a parallel role. Vertical integration turned the bar itself into a distribution arm. Control the tap, control the choice. Cheap, reliable alcohol changed city life in plain and subtle ways. Where older towns were dotted with neighborhood alehouses drawing from nearby casks, industrial cities filled with long rows of saloons, beer gardens, and tied pubs aligned with working-class schedules and new middle-class leisure. The pub or saloon became, in its way, a workplace, where wages were spent, days' events recounted, jobs found, deals made. It also became a magnet for reformers' anxieties, who saw mass-produced drink as a democratizing and possibly degrading force. The perishability of local beer gave way to something you could take home in a bottle and drink nightly. Drinking shifted from episodic to routine. Women's relationship to public drinking spaces changed sometimes, with greater presence in beer gardens and respectable saloons, sometimes pushed back into private spaces by social norms. Industrialists began counting the cost of drunk labor-lost time, accidents, inconsistent output. Some launched company-sponsored temperance initiatives or set up alternative recreation spaces to lure workers away from saloons. Progress stood next to panic, and panic had been building for decades. Temperance movements didn't burst out of nowhere when factories rose. They were a long answer to social upheavals. Industrialization, mass migration into cities, and middle-class worries about family stability and public order. In the United States, the American Temperance Society, founded in 1826, treated restraint as civic duty. The Washingtonian movement of the 1840s added a revival meeting style, using personal testimony about ruin and recovery to evangelize abstinence. By the late 19th century, women were at the forefront. The Woman's Christian Temperance Union, born in 1874 under leaders like Frances Willard, tied temperance to suffrage, domestic safety, and child welfare. They brought organization and moral authority to anti-alcohol campaigns. The Anti-Saloon League, formed in 1893, distilled those energies into hard political pressure. They professionalized lobbying, training organizers, targeting legislators, and mastering local referendums. They allied with rural evangelicals, nativist groups suspicious of immigrant saloon culture, and progressives worried about workplace discipline. They turned alcohol into not just a private vice, but a public menace, a vector for poverty, violence, and corruption. The emphasis shifted from moral persuasion to lawmaking. The culmination in the US was the Prohibition experiment. In 1919, the 18th Amendment was ratified, and Congress passed the Volstead Act to define and enforce a nationwide ban on intoxicating liquors, effective January 1920. For many reformers, nationalists, suffragists, rural Protestants, workplace efficiency crusaders, this looked like a rational, even scientific public policy victory. For the beverage industry and for many ordinary drinkers, it was a shock. Legally, taverns closed, breweries and distilleries pivoted or died. Grain supplies were rerouted. In practice, demand didn't evaporate, it moved underground. What had been an open, taxed market turned into a clandestine one, dependent on networks, stealth, and violence. Those are precisely the conditions in which organized crime thrives. Speakeasies bloomed behind innocuous doors in cities across the country. Rum runners ran fast boats from the Caribbean and Canadian Maritimes to US shores. Moonshiners in Appalachia and elsewhere kept stills running in hollows and barns. Barrels hid below false floors, labels lied, officials were bribed. The supply chain compressed into a system willing to defend itself with guns. Al Capone, presiding over Chicago's illegal liquor trade, became the most infamous face of this shadow economy. When he finally went to prison in 1931, it was for tax evasion, not murder, not bootlegging. That detail says a lot about where enforcement tools actually bit. The United States wasn't alone in experimenting with prohibitions and near prohibitions. Finland imposed national prohibition in 1919. It lasted until 1932 and fostered thriving smuggling networks from Estonia and Sweden. Norway and Iceland adopted partial bans and strict controls. Sweden, after a 1922 referendum, rejected full prohibition, developed a state-run retail monopoly and rationing systems instead. Canada tried provincial prohibitions with mixed results. Across the British Empire, local dry laws, licensing constraints, and missionary-driven temperance policies shaped colonial governance. The pattern repeated. Outright bans tended to displace consumption into illicit channels rather than erase it. Those clandestine markets could be violent and untaxable. When bans were lifted, governments took note. Better to regulate and tax than to drive demand entirely underground. In the US, the combination of persistent drinking, rising organized crime, and the financial crisis of the Great Depression helped swing opinion. In 1933, the 21st Amendment repealed national prohibition and handed most alcohol regulation back to the states. The federal experiment ended, but it left a legacy federal enforcement agencies that would morph into broader law and order institutions, and an enduring cautionary tale about the limits of broad bans. Globally, temperance rhetoric slowly shifted into more clinical language. By mid-century, more experts spoke of alcoholism as a medical and social problem, rather than solely a moral failure. Alcoholics Anonymous, founded in 1935 in Akron, Ohio, by Bill W. and Dr. Bob, crystallized a new approach: the language of disease, recovery, and peer support, a quasi-spiritual mutual help framework that still shapes treatment culture. Ironically, coerced illegality had a creative upside, especially behind the bar. Driving alcohol into the black market altered what and how people drank. Speakeasies needed drinks that softened the blows of rough spirits. If your gin came from a questionable still and tasted like chemical regret, sugar, citrus, bitters, and liqueurs became your allies. Bartenders learned to disguise flaws with balance and complexity. This improvisation plugged into an older current. Cocktail culture had deep 19th century roots. Printed recipe books boomed alongside urban saloons. Jerry Thomas, the flamboyant professor behind the bar in New York and San Francisco, published his Bartender's Guide in 1862, codifying recipes and theatrics. He turned the bartender into a craftsman, a performer with jiggers and shakers instead of hammer and saw. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, classic cocktails like the Sazerac, from early 19th century New Orleans using cognac or rye and bitters, the Manhattan, likely 1870s New York, and emerging martinis began to frame urban sophistication. The martini, with its contested origin story, evolved into a cold, focused statement of gin or vodka, and vermouth a glass-sized claim to modernity. After repeal and through mid-century, cocktails didn't just reappear, they proliferated. The cocktail bar became an emblem of cosmopolitan life. At London's Savoy Hotel, American-born bartender Harry Craddock ran the American bar after World War I, and in 1930 published the Savoy Cocktail Book, preserving pre-prohibition formulas and the sleek mood that went with them. In the US, the imagination turned toward the exotic. Polynesia, or an American fantasy version of it, became a shared dream. Don the Beachcomber, born Ernest Raymond Beaumont Gant, opened his first tiki bar in Los Angeles in the mid-1930s, decorating with bamboo, masks, and rum-heavy drinks. Victor Bergeron Trader. Vic followed with a chain that polished and commercialized the aesthetic. Claiming the Mai Tai in 1944, a claim Don Beach also contested. The Mai Tai rum, lime, orange curacao, Orgeat was an escapist postcard in a glass for Americans, fresh from the Pacific fronts of World War II. Tiki wasn't just decor, it was commentary. It capitalized on post-war prosperity, fascination with Hawaii, statehood in 1959, and fantasies of tropical freedom. The drinks were often structurally complex, layered rums, multiple juices, syrups, bitters. They were engineered for spectacle and potent sweetness, ideally consumed in groups and in public. Across the Atlantic and in big cities worldwide, the martini stayed as an icon of mid-century Polish. Hotel lounges and supper clubs built image around chilled glasses and impeccable suits. Hollywood glamorized it. Advertising packaged it. Yet over time, this glamour hid a creeping industrial dullness. Ready-mix cocktail bases, bargain liqueurs, and pre-batched sours seeped into bars. By the 1970s and 80s, cocktail quality had sagged in many places, replaced by neon blender drinks, corn syrup mixers, and sugary shortcuts. The late 20th, early 21st century cocktail revival walked in as both nostalgia and critique. Starting in the late 1980s and building through the 1990s and 2000s, bartenders and writers began to resurrect pre-prohibition recipes, treating them with lab-grade respect and chef-level ingredient standards. Dale DeGroff, at New York's Rainbow Room in the 1980s-90s, is often credited with reintroducing craft, fresh citrus, proper ice, classic tools, balanced recipes. In the late 1990s, Sasha Petraske opened Milk and Honey in New York's Mall, rule-driven, focused on precision, simplicity, and sincere hospitality. His approach measured, thoughtful, quiet spread into a global standard. Bartenders relearned old skills: how to stir, not shake, how to dilute, how to use bitters properly. Writers like David Wondrich turned archives and dusty bar manuals into living reference works. Books like Imbibe reconnected modern bartenders with 19th century formulas and forgotten categories like punches and flips. Modern mixology became, in part, a critique of the factory-made taste of mid-century. Small batch syrups, house bitters, barrel-aged cocktails, fat-washed spirits, they all signaled resistance to homogenization. At the same time, globalized supply chains that had grown up for beer, wine, and spirits now serviced niche bars, specialty rums, rare amari, craft agave spirits, obscure vermouths. Contemporary signatures like Sam Ross's Penicillin, a Scotch, ginger, and lemon concoction that feels both medicinal and comforting. Or the revived Last Word, a once obscure pre-prohibition mix of gin, chartreuse, maraschino, and lime, joined classics on serious menus. Craft distilling grew alongside craft cocktails. Small producers made gins perfumed with local botanicals, whiskies aged in non-standard barrels, and rums that explored cane varieties and fermentation styles. Their bottles landed in bars that cared about provenance as much as proof. A new wave of bar aesthetics followed. Speakeasy-style rooms with unmarked doors and reservation-only policies evoked Prohibition's romance. Molecular mixology borrowed tricks from fine dining kitchens' foams, clarifications, smokes. Zero-waste bars tried to use every citrus peel and herb stem. Some bars staged the bartender as quiet surgeon, others revived the flamboyant showman model. Branding predictably adapted. Boutique producers built identities around terroir, heritage, and handcraft, selling stories as much as spirits. Large conglomerates bought or imitated them, setting up craft sub-labels, sponsoring high-end bars, and polishing brand histories. Throughout, the cocktail served as cultural barometer. It mirrored how cities absorb foreign ingredients and refashion them into local ritual. It showed how prohibition and regulation can push creativity sideways rather than snuff it out. It revealed how science and capital can standardize flavor from Manchester to Milwaukee, even as marketing whispers that each bottle is special. Cocktail culture has always been an art of adaptation, borrowing from imperial trade routes and neighborhood gardens, playing with identity, sometimes assigning exotic names to complex colonial legacies. Tiki's borrowings from Polynesian imagery and myth, the sugar and slavery history braided into rum, the way branding compresses all that into a neat label, These all carry ethical questions. If you step back and let the long arc play like a track, you hear steam hissing in a Burton brewery, a compressor kicking on in a Copenhagen lagering room, bottles clinking down a St. Louis conveyor and being crowned with caps, a furtive knock on a speakeasy door, metal shaker biting against metal, the precise clack of a jigger in a modern bar. It's one continuous melody. Technology made alcohol consistent and mobile. Mass production made it common. That commonness sparked moral and political reactions. Temperance, prohibition, regulation that aimed less at annihilating alcohol than at managing it. Prohibition showed the limits of blunt bans and the resilience of demand. Temperance recast drunkenness as a public health and social order concern. Cocktails taught us to balance sharp with sweet, to find sociability in carefully measured cups. The line from monastery mash tun to industrial bottling plant to speakeasy shaker to modern craft bar is long, but it's still pouring. The 20th century turned alcohol from a mostly local ritual, a matter of custom, family, and neighborhood, into an object of national statistics and global policy. Governments began counting it, charting it, debating it in legislative halls and medical journals. The century opened under the banner of temperance and closed with epidemiologists, neuroscientists, and health economists speaking with authority. In the United States, prohibition was the early dramatic experiment. The 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act, by aiming to sever alcohol from daily life, inadvertently taught states that they would never again hand the business entirely back to private hands without conditions. After repeal, alcohol stayed under watch, taxed, licensed, zoned, and subject to a growing web of public health concerns. As the moral heat of prohibition cooled, science took a clearer seat at the table. Medicine and public health institutions began to reframe the issue. Alcoholism shifted from pure vice in the sermon to a condition in the clinic, something that could be described, categorized, and perhaps managed. E.M. Jelinek's mid-century work, the famous J-curve, Typologies of Alcohol Dependence, helped institutionalize the disease concept of alcoholism. That thinking nudged clinicians and policymakers towards screening, classification, and medication, not just blame. In 1970, the U.S. Congress created the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, NIAAA, a bureaucratic marker that the federal state now saw alcohol as a research and policy domain. Internationally, the World Health Organization began pressing member nations to treat alcohol as a global health problem, not just personal choice gone wrong. Epidemiology, the art of counting and correlating reconfigured public understanding. Large cohort studies, like the Framingham Heart Study, begun in 1948, and later national registries, tracked drinking behavior alongside illness and mortality. Patterns emerged. Heavy use lined up with cirrhosis, injuries, violence, and certain cancers. Lifetime drinking profiles linked to social outcomes. At the same time, some data seemed to show that moderate drinkers had lower rates of coronary heart disease than abstainers. That latter signal, first surfacing in the 1970s and 80s, fed a seductive public narrative. Maybe a little alcohol was good for the heart. In 1992, Serge Renaud and colleagues crystallized this into the phrase, the French paradox. How could the French, with relatively high saturated fat intake, have fewer heart attacks? Maybe, the media said, it was the red wine. Polyphenols, resveratrol, dark grapes as cardiac shield. Labs raced to measure grape skin molecules. Press releases simplified nuanced findings into simple slogans. What got lost was the complexity. These were observational associations, confounded by wealth, diet, medical care, exercise, and social factors. Moderate drinkers often differ from non-drinkers in many ways that influence health. Correlation is not the same as a glass-by-glass guarantee. At the same time, evidence for harm piled up. By late century, the consensus was strong. Chronic heavy drinking causes liver cirrhosis. Alcohol increases risk for cancers of the mouth, throat, esophagus, liver, and supported by growing data breast. Biomarkers like gamma-glutamyl transferase, GGT, and carbohydrate-deficient transferrin, CDT, moved from research to practice as imperfect but useful tools to flag heavy use. Diagnostic manuals evolved. The DSM through 1980 and later DSM editions formalized alcohol dependence and abuse as mental health diagnoses. The WHO developed the Audit Screening Questionnaire, 1989, as a practical, clinic-friendly way to spot hazardous drinking. Treatment strategies multiplied. Disulfiram, antabuse, had been around since mid-century. Naltrexone, approved in the 1990s, promised to blunt cravings for some patients. Psychosocial therapies and mutual aid groups like AA remained central. Policy changes often followed tragedy and activism. The rise of the automobile dramatically raised the stakes. Alcohol-related crashes pushed drunk driving out of the realm of bad luck into criminal law. Mothers Against Drunk Driving, MADD, founded by Candice Lightner in 1980 after her daughter was killed by a drunk driver, turned personal loss into national advocacy. They pushed for tougher penalties, widespread use of breath testing, and lower legal blood alcohol concentration, BAC, limits. In 1984, the U.S. National Minimum Drinking Age Act pressured states to raise purchase age to 21 by tying it to federal highway funds. BAC limits in many countries dropped from 0.10% to 0.08%, and in some places lower for novice drivers. Random breath testing and sobriety checkpoints became normal, increasing the chance of detection and altering social expectations. Regulation expanded on other fronts. Labeling laws trickled in, often over industry resistance. In the US, the Alcoholic Beverage Labeling Act of 1988 required the now familiar Surgeon General's warnings about pregnancy and impaired driving. Debates over calorie counts, ingredient disclosure, and health risk communications put public health advocates at odds with manufacturers. France, long entwined with wine culture, passed the Loi Evin in 1991, sharply restricting alcohol advertising and sponsorship, especially in relation to sports. Nordic countries maintained or refined state retail monopolies, Systembolaget in Sweden, Alko in Finland, limiting outlets and marketing. In many jurisdictions, governments experimented with zoning, limiting outlet density, restricted hours and minimum pricing. Industry pushed back. Producers and trade groups funded research, promoted drink responsibly campaigns, crafted voluntary advertising codes, and lobbied against strict tax or marketing regulations. The structural tension was obvious. Profits grew with volume, while public health goals often pointed toward less consumption overall. Media amplified the noise. One day, headlines celebrated red wine's heart benefits. The next, they reported a study on alcohol and cancer risk. Scientific nuance rarely survived intact in short articles. Consumers received a mixed message. Alcohol as both mild medicine and known toxin. In this tug of war, licensing systems, excise taxes, advertising rules, and surveillance systems became tools of contested governance. The conflict resembled the fight over tobacco, but with more ambiguity. Alcohol had been welded into religion, cuisine, and social life for millennia. As the 20th century closed, a new countercurrent stirred against the industrial giants, small-scale, taste-driven producers. The craft revolution. The craft beer wave has a few key early names on the American side. Fritz Maytag bought and revived Anchor Brewing in San Francisco in 1965, saving its steam beer. Jack McAuliffe founded New Albion in 1976 in Sonoma County, showing that a tiny brewery could survive making flavor-forward ales. Ken Grossman and Paul Camusi launched Sierra Nevada in 1980 in Chico, California, putting hop-bright American Pale Ale on the wider map. Jim Koch's Boston Beer Company, founded in 1984 with Samuel Adams, demonstrated that heritage recipes plus savvy marketing could scale. In the UK, CAMRA, the Campaign for Real Ale, founded in 1971, had already been fighting to preserve cask-conditioned ales against homogenized keg beer. By the 1990s, that spirit, respect for flavor, tradition, and small producers had gone global. Craft wasn't just taste, it was logistics and law. Small breweries forged direct relationships with hop farmers and maltsters, experimented with new yeast strains, and built business models around tap rooms, brew pubs, and local distribution. They relied on changes in state and national laws, tasting room permissions, self-distribution carve-outs, lower tax rates for small producers. A parallel revolution unfolded in wine and spirits. Micro-distilleries emerged, working on whiskies, gins, rums and liqueurs with local botanicals and grains. The farm-to-glass ethos connected producers to farmers and drinkers to landscapes. Legal structures mattered. In the US, the three-tier system, producer, wholesaler, retailer, a legacy of post-prohibition regulation, often disadvantaged small producers. Gradual reforms and exceptions, brewpub licenses, direct-to-consumer shipping allowances for wineries, tasting room provisions made it possible for small outfits to reach customers. The 2005 Supreme Court, ruling in Granholm versus Heald, loosened restrictions on interstate wine shipping, giving many small wineries a national audience. Digital technology amplified everything. Rating apps like Untapped, Beer, and Vivino, Wine, turned consumer opinion into instant public data. Instagram allowed breweries and bars to showcase can art, tap lists, and cocktails to audiences far beyond their neighborhoods. A limited release in a small city could become an international pilgrimage target overnight. Wine saw its own insurgency in the form of the natural wine movement, building on earlier low-intervention ideas from figures like Jules Chauvet. Producers in regions such as Beaujolais, the Loire, Friuli, and beyond championed indigenous yeasts, minimal sulfur, and low-intervention cellar work. Extended skin contact, even on white grapes, returned in some cellars. Writers like Alice Firing pushed natural wine into the spotlight in the 2000s, framing it as authenticity versus industrial manipulation. Critics complained about volatility and Brettanomyces funk. Fans celebrated texture, liveliness, and a sense of place. Barrel innovation swept through beer and spirits in parallel. Goose Island's Bourbon County Stout, first brewed in the early 1990s, aged imperial stout in bourbon barrels, opening many brewers' eyes to what wood and residual spirit could do for beer. Distillers expanded on traditional practices of finishing whiskey in sherry, port, or other wine casks to create layered flavor profiles. Brewers experimented with barrel-aged sours, mixed fermentation ales, and hybrid projects, IPA finished in wine barrels, spirits finished in beer casks. Sustainability issues, once peripheral marketing copy, moved toward the center as climate reality asserted itself. Vineyards that had depended on predictable seasons watched harvest dates march earlier. The extreme European heatwave of 2003 scorched vines and shocked producers into realizing that their climate baselines were shifting. In California, cycles of drought and wildfire drove home similar lessons. Fires like the 2017 Tubbs Fire and the 2020 Glass and LNU Lightning Complex fires introduced smoke taint to the vocabulary of wine and grape growers. Grapes absorbing smoke compounds that later released as ashy flavors in wine. Growers experimented with canopy management, harvest timing, different rootstocks, and even relocating plantings to higher altitudes or more northerly latitudes. Regions once marginal for wine southern England, parts of Scandinavia, Canadian provinces began to look more viable. English sparkling wine, once a curiosity, started winning serious awards. At the same time, traditional regions wrestled with water stress, heat, and new pests. Hop and barley growers felt similar pressure. Hops crave water and cool nights. Barley needs stable seasons. Breeding programs pursued heat and drought-resistant cultivars. New hop regions emerged, New Zealand, Tasmania, parts of the Pacific Northwest, producing distinctive flavor profiles that fed the craft scene's thirst for novelty. Brewers and distillers, heavy users of water and energy, increasingly turned to closed-loop systems. Heat recovery from stills and kettles, anaerobic digesters turning spent grain into biogas, on-site wastewater treatment, and collaborations where one producer's waste became another's input. Sustainability certifications, organic, biodynamic, carbon neutral, became selling points and, in some cases, regulatory demands. Taste and social norms evolved alongside these material shifts. A sober, curious turn emerged among many younger drinkers, framed by movements like Dry January, promoted in the UK in the 2010s, and by books such as Annie Grace's This Naked Mind and Ruby Warrington's Sober Curious. Drinking less, or not at all, began to carry a different social meaning, less stigma, more wellness narrative. Non-alcoholic and low-alcohol drinks stepped up as more than grudging substitutes. Seedlip, launched in 2015, marketed itself as a distilled non-alcoholic spirit, built for grown-up palates in cocktail settings. Athletic Brewing, founded 2017, focused on flavorful non-alcoholic craft beer. Mainstream brands pushed 0.0 and low ABV lines. Heineken 0.0, non-alcoholic IPAs, de-alcoholized wines. Technology made these products better. Reverse osmosis, vacuum distillation, and specially selected yeast strains allowed producers to dial down ethanol while preserving aromatics and body far more effectively than the blunt boiling-off methods of the past. Biotechnology hung on the horizon as a possible disruptor. CRISPR and other gene editing tools opened the door to engineered yeasts that might produce fewer fusel alcohols, different ester profiles, or more glycerol for body with less ethanol. Precision fermentation using microbes to produce specific flavor molecules suggested an eventual path to mimic wine or whiskey aroma without vineyards or long barrel time. Some labs began tinkering with alcohol alternatives, molecules that might mimic some of ethanol's relaxing effects with less toxicity. These remain speculative, legally untested, and culturally unsettled. Regulations and tradition collided with these innovations. If a liquid never touched a grape, could it legally be called wine? European appellation laws, geographical indications, GI, and international treaties are designed precisely to protect definitions like champagne, Scotch whiskey, tequila. Lab-made analogues would almost certainly be forced to adopt new categories and names. Consumers, though, might be more flexible if taste, price, and environmental impact align. Circular production models gained ground. Spent grain went to livestock feed, baked goods, or bioenergy. Grape pomace became grappa, compost, pectin sauce, or base for cosmetics and supplements. Some distilleries captured waste heat to warm greenhouses or nearby buildings. These weren't just green badges. They often made financial sense under rising energy prices and stricter environmental rules. As global drinking culture networked, diversity became the baseline. Tequila and mezcal stepped out of regional status into global premium spirits, backed by stricter denomination rules and intense debates over agave cultivation, sustainability, and cultural ownership. Agave supply shocks in the 2010s revealed the vulnerabilities of boom and bust planting and disease in monocultures. Japanese whiskey and highball culture, Korean soju and makioli, Chinese baijiu, Brazilian cachaça, and countless local spirits found shelf space in cocktail bars from New York to Berlin to Sydney. A soju highball could share a menu with a Negroni without comment. Chinese demand for wine and luxury spirits shifted global flows of high-end bottles and influenced planting and pricing decisions around the world. Law and policy continued to adapt in patchwork fashion. Minimum unit pricing, MUP, for alcohol setting a floor price per unit of alcohol to target cheap, high-strength products, moved from theory to trial in places like Scotland, 2018, Wales, and parts of Canada. Early evidence suggested reductions in sales of the very cheapest, strongest beverages, though the full impact on health outcomes is still being studied and contested. Labeling pushed into new areas. calorie counts, sugar content, pregnancy warnings, and sometimes explicit cancer risk warnings. Provenance and authenticity concerns spurred experiments with blockchain and digital tracking for premium bottles to help fight counterfeiting and reassure buyers about supply chains. Excise taxes became more nuanced. Some jurisdictions tilted them to penalize cheap, strong beverages associated with the heaviest harms while offering favorable rates to small producers or lower-strength products. Licensing frameworks, too, sometimes shifted to favor local, community-oriented producers and venues over large, late-night, high-volume outlets. On the darker side, consolidation did not retreat. Global beverage conglomerates continued to acquire independent brands, invest in distribution strangleholds, and wield lobbying influence. New technologies, if capital-intensive, risked widening the gap between well-financed producers and those operating at small scale. The old truth remained. Alcohol is intoxicant and merchandise, tradition and business, small ritual and big money. The future, as it comes into focus, looks less like a single trend and more like a braid. Climate will move the map. Vineyards climb hillsides and creep north. Hop fields edge into cooler regions. Water rights fights intensify. Terroir boundaries shift. Some names become less literal, classic regions, producing different styles than in the 20th century, while new regions quietly gain prestige. Technology will open new possibilities and new fights. Edited yeasts, improved de-alcoholization, precision fermentation, and maybe synthetic psychoactives force regulators to decide what counts as wine, beer, or spirit. Traditionalists will defend definitions. Innovators and some consumers will push boundaries. Social norms will keep tilting slowly. Many young people drink less frequently, experiment with periods of abstinence, and care more about mental and physical health. That doesn't mean alcohol disappears. It means it competes with more alternatives, and its role may become more occasional, more ritualized, or more explicitly hedged with health-conscious framing. Regulation will have to juggle harm reduction, economic livelihood, and cultural tradition. Taxes may continue to shift from volume alone toward targeting products and patterns most associated with harm. Labeling may grow more candid. Zoning and licensing may try to balance nightlife economies with community well-being. And through all of it, stories will keep doing quiet work. Stories of terroir and heritage, stories of innovation and sustainability, stories of moderation and recovery. They're not just marketing hooks, they're frameworks that steer investment, shape law, and define what feels normal. Imagine, as the Forbidden Dispensary does, a near-future vineyard in 2035. Vines climbing terraces where older maps showed grain, solar panels above the winery roof, soil moisture sensors pinging data to an agronomist's tablet across the world. A small urban distillery captures waste heat to warm apartments upstairs and turns spent botanicals into compost for a rooftop garden. A wine bottle carries not just vintage and appellation, but estimated carbon footprint and a QR code linking to fermentation logs. Imagine bars with parallel menus, carefully built alcoholic drinks, and equally considered zero-proof options. Prototype functional elixirs that promise calm or connection without impairment, sitting beside classic whiskey and mezcal. Some nights people drink for nostalgia. Other nights, they drink for flavor alone. The dance between regulation, technology, and culture will continue. Uneven, contested, and sometimes surprising. There will be concessions to big industry, steps forward in public health, new opportunities for small producers, and unintended consequences we can't yet script. Knowledge, as the 20th and 21st centuries show, doesn't automatically produce wise policy. It just sets the table for better arguments. The history of alcohol has always been about adaptation. From clay jars and amphorae to copper stills and stainless fermenters, from monastic refectories to neon saloons, from royal cellars to online bottle shops, humans keep negotiating with this particular liquid, its pleasures, its harms, its meanings. The 20th century made that negotiation explicit in public institutions and medical language. The 21st layers on concerns about taste, place, and planetary limits. What comes next will blend both, the cultivation of pleasure, disciplined by science and constrained by finite resources. The glass will remain what it has long been, a small stage where memory, custom, and consequence mix. So when you set a bottle down tonight, whether it holds wine, whiskey, beer, baijiu, kombucha, or nothing alcoholic at all, you might think of labs in Bethesda and Bordeaux, activists in Washington, vintners in Friuli, brewers in Chico, cooperatives in Jalisco, and farmers edging their vines a bit farther uphill. The story is never tidy, it never was. It's a long table of choices. Every century adds a color to the next. We now have instruments, microscopes peering at yeast, satellites mapping vineyard stress, laws setting BAC thresholds, apps logging check-ins. Those tools will be used, contested, and revised. Through it all, alcohol will remain what it has always been: a liquid vehicle for memory, identity, and risk, carried down the throat of each generation and argued over afterward. The Forbidden Dispensary raises its metaphorical glass to that full, contradictory history and to the ways we might, with open eyes, drink from it.